Chapter 10, Eldermere. They continued through the forest for several hours. The closer they came to Eldermere, the more the landscape opened around them. The trees no longer stood so close together, and sunlight now spilled freely across fields and small hills beyond the forest. The wind felt gentler out here, and Gwendolyn could feel it sliding through her hair high above the ground. After a while, the birds began to follow her. First one, then several. Small, colorful birds flew around her head without the fear that humans had shown her so far. One of them landed directly in her hair near her ear. Shortly after, another settled on top of her head, as if her hair was just another tree in the landscape. Gwendolyn began to laugh. "Hey," she said, trying carefully to look up at them. "That's my hair, you know." A little blue bird hopped deeper into her pale locks. Bob smiled helplessly. "You have officially become part of nature." "That's not funny," she said, even though she was clearly amused. "What if they lay eggs in there?" Simon quickly looked up from her other shoulder. "Can birds do that?" "I really hope not," Gwendolyn answered, wide-eyed. Bob immediately started laughing again. As they continued onward, the first signs of the town began to appear. Small fields spread out before them with rows of vegetables and golden grain swaying softly in the wind. Far ahead, they could now see Eldermere. The town lay between green hills, surrounded by stone walls, with tall windmills along its edge. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from a distance, they could make out people moving between the houses. Gwendolyn smiled in relief. "We're almost there." She kept walking without thinking much more about it. Down in the fields, the farmers continued working as usual until the ground began to tremble faintly beneath them. A man stopped in the middle of lifting a pitchfork. A woman looked up from her vegetables. Thum, thum, thum. The heavy vibrations rolled rhythmically through the earth. Every gaze turned toward the forest path. Something enormous was moving in there between the trees. Several people stepped back. Then Gwendolyn emerged from between the trees. Panic struck almost instantly. "Monster! Run!" People dropped their tools and rushed away from the fields. A horse reared wildly beside a wagon farther off, and some children began screaming while adults dragged them along. But Gwendolyn did not notice it at first. She only saw the town farther ahead and the open road toward Eldermere. It was only when Bob began poking her neck that she stopped. Gwendolyn?" Simon quickly pointed downward. "Lady Gwendolyn," he said seriously, "you should probably be a little careful where you place your feet. People are not exactly used to giantess princesses." She blinked in confusion. Then she looked down. People were running in every direction beneath her. Some stood completely still, staring up with terror on their faces. Others desperately tried to move animals and wagons away from the path. One man looked up at her, went completely pale, and fainted straight into the grain. "Oh no." Gwendolyn immediately stopped and carefully crouched down beside the path. Just the movement alone made some people run farther away, but she quickly tried to keep her hands visible and calm. "Wait," she called. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt anyone." Her enormous voice rang out across the fields, deep and powerful simply because of her size, but not angry. Several people stopped uncertainly. The man who had fainted was quickly lifted by two other farmers, who patted his cheeks while staring nervously up at her. "It's the princess," someone muttered. "Princess Gwendolyn? By the gods." Slowly, the panic began to ease a little. People were no longer fleeing quite as quickly now that they could see her face more clearly. The fear was still there. Of course it was, but now it was mixed with something else. Confusion, curiosity, and in some, fascination. A little boy peeked out from behind a wagon and stared up at her with wide eyes. "She's huge," he whispered. His mother immediately pulled him closer again, but even she could not stop herself from looking up. Gwendolyn felt her cheeks grow warm under all those gazes. She suddenly felt far too visible, as if the whole world was staring at her at once. Bob leaned forward slightly from her shoulder. "See?" he said softly. "They're still scared, but they're not running anymore." Gwendolyn looked down at the people around her. Some waved cautiously, others were still pointing nervously. But no one was screaming anymore, and for the first time since she had grown, it felt as though maybe people could get used to her. Chapter 11, Lady of Eldermere. It did not take long before the town gate opened. First came the knights. They rode slowly, but their horses were restless, and several of them tossed their heads every time the ground gave a faint sigh beneath Gwendolyn's movements. Behind them came a black horse with a glossy coat and silver fittings on its harness. On its back sat a young woman in beautiful armor, polished so brightly that the morning sun slid across it like water. The people in the town fell silent when they saw her. "Lady of Eldermere," someone whispered. She was younger than Gwendolyn had expected. Not old and stern like most important people in books, but straight-backed, calm, and with a gaze that cut straight through all the panic around her. One eye was milky white and blind, and a scar ran down the side of her face, but it did not make her any less beautiful. If anything, it gave her something strong, almost unbreakable, as if she had stood before danger before and refused to move. She stopped her black horse in front of Gwendolyn, jumped down with a heavy thud, and walked straight toward her while the knights stayed close behind. Gwendolyn remained crouched down so she would not seem any larger than she already did. The woman stopped before her and tilted her head back. "Miss Gwendolyn," she said clearly, "what in the world has happened to you?" She let her gaze move up and down Gwendolyn's enormous figure. "How did you become so—" She hesitated briefly. "Large?" Gwendolyn immediately felt heat rise in her cheeks. It was a flower," Bob shouted from up on her shoulder. The lady blinked and looked around. Bob leaned farther forward. "A magical flower. A very irresponsible plant, if you ask me." Gwendolyn glanced down at him. "Bob, I don't think she can hear you from up there." "Oh," Bob straightened his clothes. "Yes, that is one disadvantage of speaking from a mountain." "Let me help." Gwendolyn carefully lifted her hand to her shoulder and first picked Bob up between her fingers. She placed him gently on the ground in front of the lady, then did the same with Simon, who immediately adjusted his armor as if he had not just been carried around on a princess's shoulder. Bob bowed deeply to the young woman. "Miss Sophie, it is an honor to meet you." Lady Sophie nodded calmly. "Bob?" "What has happened to Miss Gwendolyn," Bob began, "is a mixture of curiosity, poor book writing, and a flower that clearly has no sense of moderation." He explained everything. The book, the forest, the giant flower, the growth, the hidden meadow. There was no reason to dress it up, and he did not, although now and then he made it sound a little more comical than Gwendolyn herself felt it had been. Sophie listened without interrupting. When Bob was finished, she looked up at Gwendolyn again. "That was not wise of you." Gwendolyn shrank in on herself a little. "No. What if the flower had made you ill?" Sophie continued. "Or if you had become even larger than this?" Gwendolyn's eyes flickered briefly. She did not want to think about that at all. Sophie sighed quietly, but her voice did not become harsh. "But what is done, and now you wish to speak with the witch." Bob nodded. "Exactly." A brief silence fell. Then Sophie said, "She is no longer here." Bob lost a little of his smile. Gwendolyn went stiff. "What?" "The witch once lived in Eldermere," Sophie said, casting a glance toward the town behind her. "But people did not like her. Or, at least, she believed they did." For a moment, she looked tired, as if the story still troubled her. Many here were kind to her. Several traded with her. Some were afraid, yes, but not all. She simply believed the town hated her. In the end, she moved out to the mushroom. Gwendolyn blinked. "The mushroom?" "An old, enormous mushroom deep out by the marshlands," Sophie explained. "She sells her things from there now. Herbs, elixirs, small magical objects. Not many go out there because there are monsters in the area." Bob scratched his beard. "That sounds like her." Sophie looked up at Gwendolyn again. Her one good eye moved over the princess's enormous form from her hands near the ground to her head far above the fields. "But with your new size," she said calmly, "I do not think there are many monsters that can harm you." Gwendolyn did not know whether that was supposed to comfort her or make her more nervous. Sophie turned and pointed toward a narrow path that disappeared between the hills farther east. "Follow that road. It leads toward the marshlands. If you see the great mushroom, you are close. She lives beneath it." Gwendolyn looked in that direction, then back at Sophie. "Thank you," she said softly. Sophie nodded. "And Miss Gwendolyn?" "Yes?" Lady Sophie looked up at her with a serious but not unkind expression. "Walk carefully, not only for your own sake." Gwendolyn looked down at the people around her, the fields, the houses, and the small humans still staring up at her. Then she nodded slowly. "I promise." Chapter 12. The Troll in the Forest. Gwendolyn carefully picked Bob up again and placed him back on her shoulder. The old adventurer settled in with a small, satisfied sigh, as if riding around on a giantess princess had somehow become completely normal by now. Then she looked down at Simon. "Are you ready?" Simon immediately straightened and placed one hand dramatically against his chest. "I was born ready." Bob sighed from up on her shoulder. "That's what you said when you were stuck in a tree." Simon ignored him with impressive concentration. Gwendolyn laughed softly and then lifted him back onto her other shoulder. A moment later, she slowly stood and began walking away from Eldermere. This time, she was even more careful with her steps. She walked around the fields, avoided the stone walls, and kept far away from the houses so no one would fear that she might step wrong. Behind them, people remained standing and watched her leave. Some waved cautiously, others still only stared in silence. The path led them farther and farther away from the town until the landscape began to change. The green fields slowly disappeared behind them, and the trees grew darker, thicker. Sunlight had a harder time slipping through the branches here. After a while, the path split. One road continued through ordinary forest. The other... Gwendolyn stopped for a moment and looked toward it. Even from a distance, the area seemed different. The air almost looked heavier in there. The trees were crooked and covered in dark moss, and the ground had a damp, gray color, as if the sun rarely reached all the way down. "That must be the road to the marshlands," Bob muttered. Simon placed his hand on his sword. "I already don't like this place." Gwendolyn swallowed and began walking that way. The farther they went in, the quieter the forest became. There were fewer birds here, fewer sounds in general. Only the wind between the branches and the heavy thump of her own steps. Then she stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" Bob lifted his head. Far ahead, there was a strange sound. Not a roar, not a growl. It sounded like crying. Something large was crying. Simon immediately drew his sword halfway. "Be careful, princess," he said seriously. "Just because you are large does not mean the monsters out here cannot hurt you." Gwendolyn immediately felt the nervousness return. She could hear her own heart a little too clearly again as she slowly moved toward the sound. The crying grew louder, deeper, heavier. At last, she pushed some large branches aside and saw the figure. A troll. It sat between several dark stones with its back against an old tree. It was enormous, far larger than normal humans, but still much smaller than Gwendolyn was now. Its skin was gray-green and rough like old bark, and its shoulders were as broad as wagons. But the strangest thing was not its size. It was sitting with both hands in front of its face, crying loudly. Huge tears fell between its fingers and down into the earth beneath it. Gwendolyn slowly crouched down so she would not seem threatening. At that same moment, Simon jumped up on her shoulder with his sword fully drawn. "Careful, princess," he shouted. "It's a monster." The troll stopped crying for a moment. Then it lifted its head. Its eyes were red and wet, and when it saw Simon pointing his sword at it, it only began sobbing even harder. "Everyone says that," it wailed in a deep, clumsy voice. "Me not monster, me just very big, not evil." All three of them went completely still. The troll wiped its nose with the back of its hand, which sounded like someone dragging a blanket across stone. "People scream." It continued sadly. "Throw stones. Say me ugly monster." Simon blinked several times. Bob slowly scratched his beard. And Gwendolyn, she felt something heavy strike her right in the chest. For the first time since she had grown, she did not just see a monster in front of her. She saw something that sounded exactly like herself. Chapter 13. The Troll Bellis. Gwendolyn sat quietly in front of the troll and looked at his wet eyes, his large rough hands, and the way he tried to make himself smaller, even though he was far too big to hide properly. "But," she said carefully, "you are a troll. Most trolls we've read about usually do evil things." The troll lowered his gaze. "But you don't?" she asked. He slowly shook his head and stood up. He was large enough to make the ground creak beneath him, but beside Gwendolyn, he almost seemed small. He stood with his shoulders pulled up, as if he expected someone to shout at him again. "Me not like the others," he said. "Me love beautiful things. Flowers, birds that sing, water running between stones." He pointed clumsily toward the forest. "Me sit and listen, just relax. Me not mean to people." His mouth trembled a little. "But people always run." Other trolls say me not real troll. Bob looked at him for a long moment. For once, he did not have a joke ready right away. He leaned slightly forward from Gwendolyn's shoulder and said gently, "Then maybe you are simply something better than a real troll." The troll blinked, as if the words had touched a place no one had ever reached before. Simon still stood with his sword in his hand, but the tip had lowered. He looked completely confused. "I have fought trolls before," he muttered. "They usually throw stones, or people, sometimes both." "That sounds rude," the troll said sadly. Simon stared at him. "Yes, that actually was rude." Gwendolyn felt a small smile appear. Then she had a thought that felt both foolish and right at the same time. "You can come with us," she said. Simon immediately turned toward her. "Princess!" Gwendolyn did not look away from the troll. "Maybe you can come home with me. There are gardens at the castle, birds, fountains, flowers everywhere." The troll's eyes grew wider. "There are? Beautiful things?" "Many," said Gwendolyn. Simon looked up at her in panic. "Your parents will never allow it." Gwendolyn took a deep breath. "No," she said honestly. "They probably won't." Simon opened his mouth, but she continued. "But I'll make them." The troll looked up at her, and a small, careful smile spread across his rough face. "Giant girl is kind to me," he said quietly. "Me would like to try." Gwendolyn smiled warmly. "What is your name?" The troll straightened a little, as if his name was something very important. "Me name Bellis." Bob placed a hand over his heart. "A troll named after a flower. That actually explains quite a lot." Bellis smiled a little wider. And for the first time, the marshlands did not seem quite so dark anymore. Chapter 14. The witch Tilda Gwendolyn was still smiling a little after meeting Bellis. It felt strangely nice to meet someone else who was judged because of his size. "Bellis?" she said carefully. "Do you know the witch who lives out here?" The troll's face immediately lit up a little. "Me know Tilda," he said happily. "Tilda very kind. Me help her with her beautiful garden." Bob nodded approvingly from her shoulder. "Then she is already more sensible than most people." Gwendolyn leaned forward slightly. "That sounds good. Can you show us the way to her?" This time, Bella's smile became smaller. Not gone, just uncertain. "Tilda not like people," he said slowly. "She thinks people stupid. She talked to herself a lot. Many people up in her head." Bob leaned forward a little. "That is called being a wizard," he said dryly. "Half of them argue with themselves before breakfast." Simon muttered quietly, "I already do not like her." Gwendolyn looked down at Bellis again. "But she might be the only one who can make me normal." Her voice grew quieter. "Bellis, please, we just need to ask if she can help me." Bellis went completely still. He looked up at her for a long time with a focused expression, as if he was truly trying to think hard. His heavy brows drew together, and he stood without saying anything for so long that Simon began looking nervously around the forest. At last, Bellis nodded heavily. "Okay, me show way." He turned around and began walking through the marshlands again. Simon immediately looked up at Gwendolyn. "I do not like this." She slowly stood up again and began following Bellis. "Don't worry," she said. "What's the worst that can happen?" Bob sighed deeply. "That," he said, "is exactly the kind of thing that always leads to trouble." Gwendolyn could not help smiling a little. They continued through the dark area for some time. The forest became stranger the farther in they went. The trees were covered in enormous mushrooms, some of them larger than wagons, and small glowing plants grew between the roots. The air smelled of wet earth, flowers, and something sweet, almost spicy. Then the forest suddenly opened up. Before them stood a small hut among gigantic mushrooms. The roof was covered in moss and flowers, and all around it grew little gardens filled with plants in every possible color. Some of the flowers glowed faintly. Others moved slowly as if turning toward sounds instead of the sun. Bellis pointed proudly. "Tilda lives here." Gwendolyn looked around with wide eyes. It was beautiful. Strange, yes, but beautiful. The place felt like a mixture of nature and magic, as if the forest itself had built the hut for someone it liked. Then she spotted the woman. She was walking among the flowers with a basket on her arm. She looked to be in her mid-50s, with long gray hair, braided down over her shoulders, and a dark green cloak filled with small pockets and strange bottles. She had glasses perched on the very end of her nose and seemed completely absorbed in something in front of her, or someone. "No, no, no," the woman said irritably. "I told you, The blue flowers go next to the purple ones. She stopped, looked to the side. Oh, stop being dramatic. You are a plant. She walked on and pointed toward a flower bed. And you need to stop leaning over the mushrooms. You're choking them. Gwendolyn blinked several times. Is she talking to the flowers? Tilda talks to everything, Bellis whispered proudly. The woman suddenly stopped. She stood completely still. Then she slowly turned her head toward the edge of the forest, straight toward Gwendolyn. Her eyes grew very large behind her glasses. A few seconds passed in total silence. Then she sighed heavily and took off her glasses. Oh no, she muttered. Now I'm hallucinating giantess princesses again. Chapter 15. The Witch with Three Voices. Gwendolyn moved a little farther toward the small hut, and even that careful movement made the ground give a heavy sigh beneath her boots. The flowers in Tilda's garden trembled, some of the little glowing mushrooms blinked, and a basket of herbs slowly tipped over onto its side. Tilda stared up at her. Oh, she said, taking off her glasses again to polish them on her sleeve. That's new. She placed the glasses back on her nose and narrowed her eyes. Normally, they just stand there and disappear when I blink. Then her face changed slightly. Not much, but enough that her eyes became sharper, and her voice dropped lower, darker, and far more certain. Tilda, you fool. She is real. Gwendolyn went stiff. Simon and Bob sat completely still on her shoulders. Tilda straightened and answered herself in her normal voice again. Yes, easy for you to say. You always look at things as if they've insulted you. The darker voice returned. Speak properly to the princess. You know better. Then a third voice sounded, tired and mumbling, as if it came from someone lying under a blanket inside her head. Would you two stop arguing? I'm trying to sleep. Everything went silent. Gwendolyn's mouth was slightly open. Simon's mouth was open a little more. Bob, who normally always had something to say, just sat there blinking. Tilda put her hands on her hips and looked irritably into the air beside herself. You've been sleeping since Tuesday. And I was very close to finishing, the third voice mumbled. Bellis walked toward her with heavy, careful steps. Tilda? The witch's face immediately lit up, as if someone had kindled a light inside her. Bellis! She clapped her hands together. My good friend, I'm so happy to see you. I have cakes inside for you. Big cakes, or big for me, small for you, but emotionally very big. The dark voice said dryly, They're burnt. They're rustic, Tilda answered sharply. The sleepy voice mumbled, They taste like chimney. That is depth of flavor. Bellis looked down a little shyly and twisted his large hands together. Sorry me interrupt you. Tilda looked confused. Us? The dark voice sighed. Yes, us. But this is Gwendolyn and her friends, Bellis continued carefully. Tilda stopped mid-motion and looked up at Gwendolyn again. This time she looked more closely. Her gaze moved over the young face, the missing crown but unmistakable royal bearing, and something familiar settled into place in her eyes. Oh, she said slowly, it is the princess. Gwendolyn smiled uncertainly. Hello? Tilda walked a few steps closer and had to tilt her head far back to see her properly. How in the world did you become so large? The dark voice immediately came forward again. It is obvious. She touched the flower that makes things bigger. Tilda nodded quickly. Yes, I knew that. The sleepy voice mumbled, No, you didn't. I was about to know it. Simon leaned forward from Gwendolyn's shoulder and stared down at the witch. She has a screw loose. Gwendolyn quickly looked toward him. Simon, forgive me, princess, but there are at least 3. Bob coughed to keep himself from laughing. Gwendolyn sighed and carefully lifted her hands to her shoulders. I think it's best if you come down. She first took Bob between her fingers and gently set him down at the edge of the garden. Then she lifted Simon down. The knight landed heavily in the grass, immediately adjusted his armor, and tried to look as if it were completely normal to be placed down from a princess's shoulder in front of a witch with several voices. Tilda leaned toward him. Knight? Simon nodded stiffly. Witch? The dark voice said, polite. The sleepy voice added, boring. Tilda ignored them both and looked up at Gwendolyn again. Her face softened a little. So, she said, you touched the giant blossom. Gwendolyn sank slightly. Yes. And now you want to be normal again? Gwendolyn looked down at her enormous hands, at the little hut, at the garden where even Bellis seemed more at home than she did. Yes, she said quietly. If you can help me. Tilda stood for a long time, looking up at her. Then she smiled crookedly. "Oh, child," she said, "I can help. But first, you must tell me exactly how foolishly you did it." Chapter 16. Cakes and Promises. Gwendolyn took a deep breath and began explaining everything again, this time in more detail. She told them about the castle, about the books, about all the times she had been told she was not ready yet. As she spoke, she could feel something building inside her chest. Not exactly anger toward her mother, but frustration. Something she had kept inside for a long time. "I know she was trying to protect me," Gwendolyn said, looking down at her hands. "I really do." She swallowed. "But I was so tired of it." Her voice grew a little weaker. Tired of staying at the castle, tired of only reading about adventures, tired of only riding through the areas my mother had approved. She looked up at Tilda. "I just wanted to see the world." A brief silence fell. "I thought the giant blossom could change that." She lifted one hand and pointed toward herself. "But look at me now." Her gaze drifted up toward the treetops. "I'm taller than the trees." For the first time since they had arrived at the hut, her voice trembled slightly. Bob stood up from the ground and placed a hand against her finger. "You did something foolish." Gwendolyn sighed. "Thank you, Bob. But you did it for the right reasons." She looked down at him in surprise. The old adventurer smiled warmly. "There is a difference." Simon nodded as well. "You wanted to explore the world." He looked up at her a little. "That is not wrong, perhaps only the way it was done." Gwendolyn could feel that it helped a little. Even Bellis nodded. Me also wanted to see world. Tilda had stood still, listening the entire time. At last, she crossed her arms. "So," everyone looked at her. "I will help you." Gwendolyn immediately straightened a little. "Really?" "Yes." Relief struck her almost at once, but Tilda continued. Bob immediately let out a sigh. "There is always a but." "I have all the things we need." Tilda pointed toward the hut. "But it will take some time." The dark voice emerged. "Tomorrow." "Yes, yes," Tilda answered. "That is not yes. Yes. It means the same thing." "It does not." The sleepy voice mumbled. "Can we argue later? I'm still trying to sleep." Simon looked toward Bob. "Is this normal?" "I have decided not to ask." Tilda turned toward the hut. "In the meantime, I have the cakes I mentioned earlier." She stopped. "They taste wonderful." The dark voice said, "They do not." "They do. They are burnt. They are caramelized. They are charred." "That is culture." Bob began to laugh. A moment later, Tilda disappeared into the hut. Gwendolyn settled more comfortably on the meadow. The ground gave a small sigh beneath her weight, but by now she had found a way to sit without breaking anything. Bellis sat down in the grass beside her. Bob and Simon found a place near the flower beds. A little later, Tilda came back out with a large tray. Several dark cakes lay on it, very dark. Simon looked at them skeptically. "Are they safe?" "We shall find out," Bob said and took one. Simon looked horrified. Everyone tasted them. Silence fell. Then Bob blinked. "Oh," Simon took another bite. "They are actually good." Bellis smiled broadly. "Tilda's cake's good." "I know," Tilda said, satisfied. The dark voice muttered, "That was luck." Tilda waved a hand irritably. Then she snapped her fingers. A green light flashed. Suddenly, a comfortable chair stood behind her. She sat down. Another snap. Two smaller chairs appeared beside it. Bob and Simon stared at them in surprise. "That," Bob said, "is much smarter than standing all day." They sat down at once. Tilda then looked up at Gwendolyn. "Unfortunately, I do not think I can summon a chair large enough for you." Gwendolyn began to smile. "That is completely okay." "Good." The sleepy voice mumbled, "Because I did not feel like building one." The sun slowly began to move lower in the sky as they sat together beside the hut. For the first time since she had found the flower, Gwendolyn did not feel alone with the problem. She sat among an old adventurer, a stubborn knight, a gentle troll, and a witch with far too many voices. And for the first time in a long while, tomorrow did not feel frightening. It felt hopeful. Chapter 17. The Dream of the City. Evening came slowly over the marshlands. First, the light between the trees turned golden, then copper-colored, and at last the shadows slid together between the great mushrooms around Tilda's hut. The small glowing plants in the garden began to shine more brightly, as if they woke when the sun disappeared. Bellis sat close to the flower beds and listened to the last birds, while Bob sat in his chair with his hands folded over his stomach and his eyes half closed. Simon had placed himself as close to Gwendolyn as possible, still with his sword within reach, even though he was clearly fighting not to fall asleep while sitting upright. Tilda came out of the hut with several bottles in her arms. Some of them bubbled faintly. Others glowed with green and purple colors that slid across the glass like living mist. "I will work on the elixir tonight," she said, placing the bottles on a small table in front of the door. "It requires calm, precision, and absolutely no interruptions." The dark voice immediately said, "And this time, we follow the recipe." "I always follow the recipe," Tilda replied. "Last time you made a soup that sang. It had talent." The sleepy voice mumbled. It sang off-key. Gwendolyn sat with her legs drawn in a little and looked down at her. Exhaustion had begun to gather in her body after everything that had happened. Her eyes felt heavy, and even her enormous hands lay still in the grass. "Thank you, Tilda," she said quietly. "Really?" Tilda looked up at her. Her face softened in the faint glow from the garden. "Get some sleep, child. Tomorrow, the world may seem a little less impossible." Gwendolyn tried to smile, but a great yawn escaped her instead. The sound made some of the flowers bend in the wind from her breath, and Bellis laughed softly. She carefully lay down on her side at the edge of the garden, far enough from the hut not to hit anything, but close enough to hear the others. The ground was soft beneath her, scented with moss and night-blooming flowers. Above her, the stars glittered between the broad caps of the mushrooms and the dark branches. She managed to hear Tilda muttering inside the hut, glass clinking, and Bob quietly telling Simon that he snored like an angry goose. Then everything slipped away. The dream began with bells. The castle bells rang loudly over the city, but it was not a festive sound. It was a warning. A hard, panicked ringing, cast out over the rooftops, down through the streets, and into every open window. Gwendolyn stood in the middle of the city. Not at the gate, not outside the walls. In the middle of it. The houses did not even reach her knees. The old stone streets she knew so well had become narrow strips beneath her. The stalls in the square looked like small colored boxes, and people moved between them like frightened insects. She tried to stand still, but her body would not obey. One of her feet slowly lifted above a row of houses, and the people below screamed. She could see them running in every direction, tiny figures stumbling over baskets, wagons, and each other as the shadow of her foot slid over them like a dark cloud. "Stop," she shouted, but her voice did not come out like a child's voice. It came out like thunder. Windows rattled. Flags on the rooftops tore loose. People threw themselves down with their hands over their heads, and some horses reared so violently that wagons tipped onto their sides. Her foot struck the ground. The stones cracked beneath her. Not with one small break, but like a wave shooting out through the street. Cobblestones sprang up around her toes, dust rose, and a little stall was crushed flat beneath the edge of her foot, wood and cloth vanishing under her weight as if the city itself were being pressed down into the earth. Gwendolyn wanted to scream. She wanted to pull back, but her body continued. She took another step, this time through the square. A fountain she had drunk from as a child shattered beneath her heel, and water exploded out into the street in a glittering silver cloud. People ran through the water, small and desperate, while her shadow slid over them again. "No, I'm not doing it on purpose," she tried to shout. No one heard the words that way. They heard only the crash of her voice and ran faster. She saw the castle farther ahead. Her home. The towers, the walls, the windows, the balcony where she had stood so many times and looked out toward the world she was not allowed to visit. Now it lay before her like a toy castle on a table. Her hand lifted. She tried to force it down, tried to clench her fingers shut, but the hand slid forward through the air, enormous and unavoidable. It struck the side of a tower. The stones gave way with a long, crunching sigh, and the entire upper section collapsed into the courtyard. Dust shot up like gray smoke. "Mother!" Gwendolyn shouted. Her own voice made the sky feel heavy. She could see people in the castle courtyard, guards, servants, small figures pointing up at her while she stood above them, far too large, far too visible, far too dangerous. She wanted to explain. She wanted to say that she was still Gwendolyn. But in the dream, her mouth opened, and no words came out. Only a deep, unfamiliar roar that sent birds fleeing from the towers and made people drop to their knees. She was not a princess in their eyes. She was the disaster. She tried to step back, but her foot struck a wall. It gave way beneath her with terrible ease. Not because she tried, not because she was angry, simply because she was there. Simply because she was too large for a world built for everyone else. Down by her feet, people ran between the cracks in the stone road. They did not see her face. They did not see the tears in her eyes. From where they stood, they saw only legs like pillars, feet like landscapes, and the shadow that came before every step. They felt the ground rise and fall beneath them whenever she moved. They felt the wind from her steps and the dust from everything she broke. Gwendolyn looked down and tried to lift her feet away from the city, but the more she fought against it, the more violently her body moved. She slipped into a street filled with market stalls. Roof tiles rained down around her. A sign with a painted apple was torn loose and spun through the air. A small tree in the square snapped beneath the side of her foot, and she could feel everything far too clearly. Wood, stone, earth, the city beneath her. "I don't want to be a monster," she whispered, but the dream did not answer. The castle gates opened. Her mother stood there, small, far too small. She stood before the gate in her dress, straight-backed and pale, while the guards around her drew swords that looked like needles from Gwendolyn's height. Her mother's face was not angry. It was worse. She looked afraid. Gwendolyn's heart broke in the dream. "Mother, it's me!" She reached her hand forward, but her hand was too large. The shadow fell over the gate, over the guards, over her mother. People screamed again. Gwendolyn tried to stop her arm, but it slid forward as if someone were pulling it. Her mother vanished beneath the shadow. "No." Gwendolyn woke with a violent gasp. She sat halfway up so quickly that the ground beneath her shook, and several of Tilda's flowers nodded sharply in the wind from the movement. Her chest rose and fell heavily, and sweat lay cold on her forehead. She stared into the darkness without first understanding where she was. No city, no screams, no shattered gates, only Tilda's garden, the great mushrooms, the night flowers, and the small lights glittering quietly around her. Her hands were trembling. Slowly, she looked down at them, as if she was not entirely sure they belonged to her. "It was only a dream," she whispered. But the words did not feel strong enough, because the dream had not shown her something unfamiliar. It had shown her what she feared most. Chapter 18, Voices in the Night. Gwendolyn wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and tried to calm her breathing again. The night around her was quiet, but not quite quiet enough. She could still hear the echo of the dream somewhere inside herself. The bells, the screams, stone cracking beneath her feet. Her mother's face, small and afraid, caught beneath the shadow of her hand. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, as if she could force the image away. "Is everything all right?" The voice was gentle. Gwendolyn opened her eyes and looked down. Tilda stood not far from her in the faint glow of the luminous flowers. She had a blanket over her shoulders and a small cup in her hand, steam rising from it in soft spirals. Her hair was messier than before, and her glasses sat crookedly on her nose, but her smile was kind. Not teasing, not strange, just kind. "You had a nightmare?" she asked. Gwendolyn swallowed and nodded slowly. "Yes." Tilda walked a little closer, but kept a good distance, as if she knew Gwendolyn might still be startled and moved too quickly by accident. "Do you want to talk about it?" Gwendolyn looked down at her hands. They lay in the grass before her, large enough to cover entire flower beds if she was not careful. Even in the moonlight, they seemed unfamiliar. "I was home," she said quietly, "in the city by the castle, but I was still like this." She drew in a breath. People were running from me. All of them. People I know. People who usually smile at me when I ride past. The guards, the servants, the children in the square. Her fingers curled slightly in the grass. I couldn't stop myself. I tried, but my body kept walking. I destroyed the streets, houses, the castle. Everything beneath my feet was crushed, and I could feel it, but I couldn't make myself stop. She looked away as her voice grew smaller. "I was a monster." Tilda did not say anything right away. She simply stood there with the cup between her hands, looking up at the enormous princess, who now seemed much younger than she had in the daylight. Not because she was smaller, but because fear had folded her inward. "That is an ugly feeling," Tilda finally said, "believing everyone sees a monster when you are only trying to be yourself." Gwendolyn looked down at her. Tilda smiled faintly, but there was something sad in it. When I lived in Eldermere, I was certain people spoke badly about me all the time. If someone fell silent when I passed by, I thought they had been talking about me. If someone laughed in the square, I believed it was at me, just because I worked with magic and elixirs. She looked toward the forest, where darkness lay heavy between the mushrooms. In the end, I grew tired of feeling unwanted, so I moved out here. Gwendolyn lifted her head a little. But I spoke with Sophie. Tilda blinked. Lady Sophie? Gwendolyn nodded. She said people actually liked you. Many of them. She said they were confused and sad when you left. Tilda went completely still. It was not the kind of silence that came when she spoke with her other voices. This was deeper than that. Her gaze slowly sank toward the cup in her hands, and the steam twisted upward in front of her face. Is that true? She asked quietly. That is what she said. Tilda looked as if someone had shifted the ground beneath her. She frowned. That was around the time I tested a new potion, 10 years ago, a very bad potion. The dark voice emerged faintly, but it did not sound as harsh as before. An extremely bad potion. Yes, thank you, I remember, Tilda muttered. The sleepy voice came almost like a distant yawn. There were more of us back then. Tilda slowly nodded. Yes, many more. Voices everywhere. Some kind, some angry, some that lied, some that only shouted about soup. Gwendolyn looked down at her seriously. Could it maybe have been them? Tilda lifted her gaze. What do you mean? The voices, Gwendolyn said carefully. Maybe they were the ones who made you believe the town was speaking badly about you. Maybe it wasn't the people in Eldermere. Tilda stood completely still. Her face did not change at once. She did not look angry, not offended, just struck, as if a door she had kept shut for 10 years had suddenly been opened a crack. Oh, she said at last. The dark voice muttered, That is possible. The sleepy voice said quietly, I said back then that we should ask someone. You slept through most of it, Tilda replied, but there was no real sharpness in her voice. She sank down onto a small stone beside the flower bed and stared toward Eldermere, even though the town could not be seen through the forest. How foolish I am, she whispered. Gwendolyn quickly shook her head. No, you were just afraid. Tilda gave a short laugh, though it sounded more like a sigh. That may be the nicest thing anyone has ever said about a very foolish decision. She looked up at Gwendolyn again, and this time her eyes were shinier behind her glasses. Thank you, Gwendolyn. For what? For saying it. I had never thought that it might have been like that. A moment passed where the night seemed softer around them. A small moth flew between the glowing flowers, and Bellis snored somewhere nearby with a deep rumble that made some of the mushrooms tremble. Tilda smiled faintly. I actually miss the town, she admitted. I miss the sound of people in the square, children running around and nearly knocking over my baskets. Old ladies complaining about the price of cough syrup, even though it works every time. She looked down at her hands. I could give the children cakes again. The dark voice immediately said after we practice not burning them. They love my cakes. Bellis loves your cakes. Bellis eats moss. From the darkness came Bellis's sleepy voice. Moss good. Gwendolyn could not help smiling. Tilda looked toward the hut, then toward the forest again. But I also like this place. My garden. My work, Bellis. She pulled the blanket closer around herself. I do not know if I am ready to go back. You do not have to decide that tonight, Gwendolyn said. Tilda looked up at her and smiled a little. No, I suppose I do not. She slowly stood and brushed a little dirt from her dress. You should try to sleep again. Gwendolyn looked down at her hands one last time. The nightmare was still inside her, but it was not as heavy as before. It was still there, like a dark stain in her chest, but now there was Tilda's voice too. Bob, Simon, Bellis, Sophie, people could become afraid. But that did not always mean they hated you. She slowly lay down again, far more carefully this time. The grass bent beneath her, and the flowers glowed faintly around her face. Good night, Tilda, she whispered. Good night, Gwendolyn. Tilda began walking back toward the hut, but stopped briefly at the door and looked toward her again. And Gwendolyn? You are not a monster. Gwendolyn lay still for a moment. Then she closed her eyes. This time, sleep came more slowly, but it came.